So I guess you're all here because you're trying to figure out how to get abroad, is that right? I only say that half joking because the thing you've done on the web is actually so easy, it's almost pathetic how easy it is to find documentation of how you get there. And if you look, for instance, at a recent START report that details ISIS's outreach capabilities, you'll see that they've now got material in 178 languages across every platform conceivable, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, of course. But then you can also go on your own little fire chat session and just have a one-on-one with your local recruiter who'll provide you with advice on how to get there, how to raise a little pocket change so you can buy yourself the airfare. And so I think one of the things that this harkens at is that, yes, historically this is sort of a phenomenon we've always dealt with, right back to the Second World War, as has been pointed out. We have this challenge with regards to Sikhs in the late 1980s and early 1990s, so it's not a new phenomenon per se, but there's two things that I think, in light of globalization, that are fundamentally changing the framework within which this happens. And one is the communications revolution, that it's just so easy to get in touch with folks. And the challenge here is what sociologists call the filter bubble, that people, even though we have this plurality of a social media universe, that people increasingly only read material that sort of reinforces their own biases. And so you're not actually exposed to a broader debate. It actually narrows the debate overall. The other is the transportation revolution, that it's so darn easy to get anywhere in the world, and it's so relatively cheap to buy yourself a ticket. And so I think in light of that, we fundamentally need to rethink the frameworks that we have in place, and this is part of a much sort of broader research program that I have on the go, which is that the movements and flows that we see under globalization largely surpass borders. If you think about cyberspace, for instance, I mean, there really aren't any borders. And yet we have these institutions of the nation state that date back to 1648 that are not particularly well suited to dealing both with the legal and the illicit flows across borders. So how do we map these institutions onto these flows in order to kind of deal with some of these collective action problems? So if you're interested in that, SHRP-funded project, $2 million, Borders and Globalization, you can look at the website, and if you want to get involved, let me know. There's lots of work to be done. So what's the research problem? So first, why does it matter? Not just because people, of course, are going abroad, but also because these folks then get injured and they come back here and they'll get themselves treated on your and my OHIP dollar. That the returnees, we have a sort of reasonable sense that a good number of these folks will eventually return here. Our prison system is not particularly well set up to accommodate them. Currently, we have real trouble with legislation detaining, let alone arresting individuals. So how do we get a handle on this particular problem? That's, of course, not speaking of all the people who run around in Canada trying to collect money for all sorts of illicit causes, trying to ship weapons and dual-use material. If you're interested in any of this stuff, I've published articles on all of this. So we have a challenge here in Canada and the West in general. For those of you in women's studies or sort of interested in sort of feminist theory and whatnot, so there's actually a really interesting gender dimension, because about 10% of the people who go are women. And women sort of have fulfilled somewhat different, in some ways, in many ways, sort of the roles they fulfill are similar to men, but there's two distinct differences. One is that they don't usually serve in combat roles, and they don't usually serve in leadership roles. But they do serve in roles such as intelligence, because often it's much easier for them to get across lines without being searched. And they also play a seductive role. And so if you're interested in sort of that element and how women in particular are being used, there's Anne Specker from Georgetown has done some terrific work on this, but so there's a whole gender dimension that has not been particularly well explored in the literature. And it caters very interestingly, especially to women who tend to come in the West from conservative families that don't let them get out very much. And so the internet becomes sort of a way for them to escape from some of these settings. So it's a very interesting dimension. And sociodemographically, inherently, as was pointed out, they come from all walks of society. So I think, as in any sort of battle plan, you need to ask three basic questions. You need to figure out who is it that we're actually fighting, or what the actual problem is. What is the goal? Are we here to destroy or to eliminate the particular problem? I don't think we're going to get around that. So then the question is, so how do we contain it? How do we mitigate it? And how much are we willing to spend? And I think there's two separate questions here. One is, how much money are we willing to spend? Because ultimately, if you put enough money towards it, then we can get a handle on it. But we do live in a limited state. And my argument is always, let's give the security forces the tools they actually need rather than throwing more money at it, because having two plumbers with a hammer still won't fix your plumbing problem if he doesn't have a wrench. And the other is, how much do you want to spend in terms of the rights and freedoms involved? And this is often portrayed as a zero-sum game. And I argued in front of the House of Commons Committee on Monday, where I was asked to testify on C-51, that argued in the Globe and Mail that security and freedom are not a zero-sum game, but rather they're complementary. This relationship has evolved over time, and so we need to continue to adapt here as we have in other policy areas. So I'll run you through a quick, sit-rep of where we're at here, historical context, provide some reflection on Canada in comparison, talk a bit about the 4 components of terrorism and the 12 mechanisms involving people who tend to go abroad, ask whether there is a particular model that can actually help us get some traction on who's most likely to be susceptible to being recruited, why foreign fighters are a problem and what to do about it. And I refer to it as foreign terrorist fighters because that's the UN designation, which is kind of hilarious because there isn't actually a UN definition of what terrorism is, because there's sort of this issue of sort of freedom fighters that folks can't agree on. But anyway, so FTF is sort of for foreign terrorist fighters. So I'll just throw up sort of some quick numbers here to give you an idea of sort of where foreign fighters tend to come from. So on the left you have it as a per million population, and then on the right you have sort of folks sort of come from what I guess we think of far and near, so sort of from within the region. And so you can immediately see that the problem is not evenly distributed. And I think that's a really important observation, because here you have a country such as Belgium, and yet Belgium and Germany, in terms of sort of the total number of people who are documented to have gone abroad, it's about twice that are thought of having gone abroad, that this is what we can actually document, have about the same number of people who've gone abroad, and yet Belgium is a country about 1/8 of the size of Germany in terms of its population. So you can see that as a social scientist, that raises some really interesting questions about endogenous effects. So any of you thinking about going to grad school, or any of you looking for a thesis topic, I can probably come up with 24 thesis topics right on this presentation here. So come and talk to me. There's lots of interesting work to be done here. So this gives you a sense that countries are not affected equally. Jordan isn't particularly surprising given that it borders the region, but Tunisia, is so 3,000 people. Here's a country of about 4 million people. It's estimated about 4,000 people have gone abroad. That's about 1/10 of 1% of their population. That's stunning. So here's our rate of, here's sort of some of the Western countries, and where Western countries fall in this, and sort of the estimated number of folks, and the per capita rate of people going abroad. And so you can see again that countries differ here substantially. And so this makes us ask some interesting questions about whether we can actually do something on, for instance, the accommodation side, the social policy side, the security side, that may encourage or inhibit people from engaging in this type of activity. So you ask him about sort of where do foreign fighters tend to come from. Well, it turns out that most of them don't come from the West. It turns out that most of them come from the region. And that's not a particular surprise. But what's a particular surprise is that, so here's sort of some of the flows. This is from the Washington Post from January, so you get a bit of a sense here. But a disproportionate number of them from sort of countries within the region. And part of the problem here is that inherently this, I think, becomes a bit of sort of the political opposition to some of these authoritarian regimes. And so this is partially related to actually trying to make these countries politically, economically viable social places to live for the folks that take up this sort of fight. Because I think if you think of it from a rational choice perspective, if you're a young person and you live in a country where really, you can't get a job and you can't get into the university, and even if you got into the university, the ministers all have their kids already sewn up for their future government jobs and whatnot, you probably would get a little frustrated too. And so this becomes a way of, I guess, trying to change the status quo. And so it's a lot more than about just playing whack-a-mole and trying to hit ISIS. It's about trying to figure out how do we actually make these countries viable places to live. So just a couple of other sort of graphics here. Again, so if you look at the shading here, you can see that the problem is not evenly distributed throughout the world. Foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, I mean, this foreign fighter problem, it's stunning. There's 20,000 foreign fighters that are thought to be in Syria now. That's more than were in Afghanistan. So it's a considerable challenge. And you can see where people flock from. It's primarily from the region. That's not entirely surprising. So here's foreign fighters by origin of country and foreign fighters per capita. And you can see that some of the countries in the region actually have fairly comparable problems, both in terms of the number of fighters and fighters per capita. And it's interesting that some of the most repressive regimes are also the ones that have the greatest people joining in. This is an interesting graphic. It's relative to the Muslim population and what percentage of the Muslim population is going abroad. Now, of course, the percentage numbers here are extremely small, and the margin of error as a result is huge. But nonetheless, sort of, it again gives you a sense of that there's different endogenous dynamics going on in different countries, because otherwise we'd expect roughly the same number of people to kind of going abroad and from all countries, and that's not the case. Here's some of the routes taken. Everybody thinks that foreign fighters seem to go through Turkey, but it actually turns out that most of them actually take sort of a circuitous route, primarily through the countries in the Maghreb, and that the dislocation that is happening in Libya, for instance, has made Libya a favorite transit point into Syria. So let's think about this sort of from a social science perspective. What ultimately we need to find a way to undermine the pull factors, and the pull factors are sort of the groups that sort of the elements that give rise to groups such as ISIS, or pick your favorite sort of extremist group in the region. And so first, of course, you need to have a group. You need to have some cohesive sort of setting. You need to have an ideology that goes along with that particular group. You need to have a social support system in place that makes that particular group viable, because ultimately if you don't have organization, you don't have a recruitment mechanism, you don't have financing, you're not going to be going very, very far. And then you need to make sure that your individual members fulfill proper functions within that group. Two quick words on, and I'll give you some references at the end, so these are all sort of entire articles in and of themselves. Two quick words on sort of what we might want to look out for and who the people are who are the most likely, for instance, to go abroad or to commit terrorist acts. So we need to, I think, distinguish two separate ideas. One is sort of the radicalization challenge, and the other is sort of the what I call the war of ideas, sort of how people think about these issues. So you have people who are inert, you have the activists, you have the radicals, but the radicals in and of themselves aren't really a problem, because if you think back to the 1920s, I mean, women were considered radicals, right? And I think we'd all agree that women getting the vote wasn't such a bad idea after all. So it's sort of the folks who are at the top of the pyramid that are sort of the particular challenges. So it's radicalization leading to politically motivated violent extremism. So radicalization in and of itself is not the problem. So we're focused on a very small subset of people who are engaged in a very particular form of radicalization. Now, those particular folks tend to, there's about 12 mechanisms that have been identified with these, with folks that go. So this is work that my friend and longtime colleague Rick McCauley at Bryn Mawr has done, and has published a great 2 minutes. Oh my word! Okay, I'll talk faster. Has published a terrific book with Princeton on this. But you can see that there's about a dozen mechanisms at work here at the micro, meso, and macro level. But notice that only one of them is related to religion, and this is particularly important because religion ultimately, I think, becomes a justification for actions and a rationalization for actions in which people were going to get engaged in anyways. And the same sort of rationalization that you can get from religion, you can get from other forms of ideology, you can get from ethnicity and nationalism, you can get from ideologies of sort of working class, whatnot. So in and of itself, it's that rationalization that's particularly interesting, and that people go for any number of reasons that have nothing to do with religion. Okay, so I'll sort of skip this, but the point here is that the people who engage in politically motivated violent extremism, who are attracted to it,
and people who have ideas with regards to what needs to be done about making the world a better place. So this is sort of the mass sort of phenomenon about somehow there's some injustice being done to Muslims or whatnot across the world. Actually two separate people, and then we conflate these. And so we actually need to have two separate strategies to tackle the people who engage in violence and the people who don't have particularly sort of favorable opinions overall. And so the argument here is, so the action and the opinion pyramids, so the ideas problem and the violence problem are two separate problems. I won't go into this in great detail. There's a separate article in Canadian Journal of Political Science on this. The point here is that this is survey-based research that we did in Canada on ethnic communities. And what we're trying to show here is that there's sort of, if you do a cluster analysis, there's three sort of axes that run through here. And that the people who are not particularly happy with life and feel alienated and whatnot are down here, but they don't sympathize with violence. The people who sympathize with violence are the people who cluster down over here, and they show a very distinct behavioral pattern, including the fact that they tend to have a predisposition for breaking the law, that they usually tend to have some prior small criminal convictions, and that they tend to be involved in small group studies. So it's not that they go to mosque, it's that they go to small group studies. So we do actually have a pattern associated with this. Two quick concepts to distinguish. So anti-terrorism is the broader actions to prevent and deter and reduce the impact of terrorist acts. Counterterrorism is the kinetic actions directly against terrorists. I won't go through all this, but simply to show that Canada actually has an obligation on the United Nations Security Council resolutions. I've listed those 4 resolutions here to do a whole bunch of things about foreign terrorist fighters, and most of them we're not compliant on. These are Chapter 7 resolutions, so they're legally binding on all member states. And I've laid out in details in my submission to the House of Commons Committee on where we are not compliant and why more needs to be done. So the initiatives, so C44 with changes to the CSIS Act, C51 that many of you will be familiar with, and I won't go through all the changes here that are being proposed, but in essence, C51 makes us compliant with most of these United Nations Security Council resolutions, or at least gets us closer in terms of Passenger Protect Program, advocating politically motivated violent extremism as measures of detention, financial flows, and whatnot. Do we need Australian-type legislation that actually allows the government to declare entire parts of the world as sort of no-go areas? And then we don't get ourselves into this discussion of whether someone's fighting the good fight with the good people or with the bad people. In Australia, you simply run afoul of the law. If you go to certain parts of the world, the government has declared off limits. More needs to be done with regards to countering violent extremism, and the shift in thinking here is to preventing violent extremism as opposed to countering it. This sort of is now the novelty here is integrating this into hub approaches that police have been running with community and social groups with regards to criminal activity, and seeing whether we can actually build a counter violence sort of module into that. There's a couple of capacity building programs the Department of Foreign Affairs runs, or DFAT, I guess, Department of Foreign Affairs and Development, or whatever it is now, that have been very active, in particular in Africa, but also in other parts of the world on the counterterrorism and organized crime side. And here's some of the publications that have gone along with that, and there's a whole bunch of other work, but I hope that gave you a bit of an overview of where my thinking is on this.